What happens when a routine walk home from school turns into a terrifying encounter with a biased police officer? And a courageous teacher's intervention sparks a community-wide reckoning with racial injustice. The final bell of Northwood High rang, a sharp, metallic clang that sliced through the afternoon air. Isaiah Jackson, a lanky 17-year-old with a mop of neatly trimmed black hair, gathered his books, a worn copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X, nestled amongst his textbooks. He'd been engrossed in it during his last history class, Ms. Evans's insightful lecture on the civil rights movement weaving seamlessly with the powerful words on the page. He felt a familiar surge of pride in his heritage, pride in the progress made, and a simmering anger at the injustices that still persisted. Isaiah wasn't your typical high school student. While many of his peers were consumed by social media trends and Friday night football games, Isaiah dedicated his free time to community service, tutoring younger kids, and volunteering at the local library. He excelled academically, his sharp intellect and unwavering work ethic earning him a place on the honor roll. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer, of using his skills to fight for equality and justice, much like the heroes he read about in his history books and Malcolm X's autobiography. Today, however, the weight of the day's lesson hung heavy. Ms. Evans had ended the class with a sobering reminder of the ongoing struggle for racial equality, highlighting the persistent challenges faced by young black men in their interactions with law enforcement. The examples she'd cited, instances of racial profiling and unwarranted stops, resonated deeply with Isaiah. He knew the statistics, the disproportionate number of black youth subjected to police scrutiny, the subtle and overt forms of prejudice that permeated society. He slipped his books into his backpack, the familiar weight a comforting presence. The walk home was a familiar route, a well-trodden path that wound through quiet residential streets, past neatly manicured lawns and brightly colored houses. He usually enjoyed the solitude, the time to reflect on the day's events, to process the information he'd absorbed in class, to plan his evening study session. Today, however, the usual tranquility felt fragile, replaced by a subtle unease that mirrored Ms. Evans's warnings. The sun cast long shadows as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the afternoon light painting the street in warm hues of orange and gold. He passed Mrs. Rodriguez's house, her prize-winning roses blooming in vibrant profusion. He nodded to Mr. Henderson, the elderly gentleman who always sat on his porch, meticulously tending his bonsai trees. Everything seemed normal, yet the lingering unease persisted, a low hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. He quickened his pace slightly, a subconscious response to the nagging feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual mix of cars and pedestrians navigating the quiet suburban street. He told himself it was nothing, just the lingering effect of Ms. Evans's powerful lesson. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that prickled his senses. He reached the corner, the familiar intersection where he usually turned left towards his house. He paused, his hand instinctively reaching for the zipper of his backpack, a nervous habit he'd developed over the years. He'd always been careful, mindful of his surroundings, aware of the potential dangers that lurked, even in his seemingly safe neighborhood. He knew that being a young black man in America meant navigating a landscape fraught with unspoken risks, a reality that weighed heavily on his young shoulders. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart, and prepared to turn the corner, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The setting sun cast a long shadow, stretching before him like a silent warning. As Isaiah turned the corner, a sudden, jarring screech of tires ripped through the afternoon quiet. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. A police cruiser, its lights flashing a disconcerting blue and red, pulled up sharply beside him, blocking his path. The suddenness of it all stole his breath, the familiar unease from earlier escalating into a full-blown panic. Officer Miller, a large man with a stern face and a grim set to his jaw, emerged from the vehicle. His uniform, crisp and immaculate, seemed to amplify his imposing presence. Isaiah's breath hitched in his chest. He'd seen Officer Miller around the neighborhood before, a familiar figure patrolling the streets, but he'd never had any direct interaction with him. Now, facing the officer's imposing figure, a wave of apprehension washed over him. "Hey, you," Officer Miller barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. The tone was accusatory, the words laced with an undercurrent of hostility that made Isaiah's stomach churn. He swallowed hard, trying to compose himself, trying to remember everything Ms. Evans had said in class about maintaining calm and respectful demeanor during police encounters. "Yes, officer," Isaiah replied, his voice barely a whisper, his hands visibly trembling. He tried to keep his tone even, his posture straight, but his body betrayed his nervousness. He kept his hands visible, avoiding any sudden movements that might be misinterpreted. Officer Miller's eyes, narrowed and suspicious, scanned Isaiah from head to toe. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice dripping with skepticism. "This is a residential area. What's a kid like you doing walking around here at this time of day?" Isaiah felt a surge of anger, a hot, indignant flame igniting within him. The accusation was blatant, the implication clear. He was being profiled, judged solely on the color of his skin and the time of day. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain that he lived just a few blocks away, that he was simply walking home from school, but the words caught in his throat. He was too stunned, too overwhelmed by the unjustness of the situation. I live just down the street," Isaiah stammered, his voice barely audible. He pointed vaguely in the direction of his house, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He desperately wished Ms. Evans were here, her calm authority and unwavering support a comforting presence in this tense situation. Officer Miller didn't seem convinced. He stepped closer, his shadow engulfing Isaiah, the oppressive weight of his presence almost suffocating. "I've seen you loitering around here before," the officer declared, his tone hardening. "Hanging around with a bunch of other kids. Causing trouble." The accusation stung, a cruel twist of the knife. Isaiah had never caused any trouble, never been involved in any wrongdoing. He was a good kid, a responsible student, a contributing member of his community. Yet, here he was being accused of loitering, his character unjustly judged and dismissed based on nothing more than a prejudiced assumption. "That's not true, officer," Isaiah insisted, his voice gaining a little strength. "I've never caused any trouble. I was just walking home from school." He tried to maintain eye contact, to project an image of confidence and innocence, but his voice trembled, betraying his inner turmoil. Officer Miller remained unconvinced, his gaze unwavering, his suspicion palpable. He reached into his pocket, his hand hovering near the holster at his hip. The air crackled with tension, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of Isaiah's racing heart. The simple walk home, a routine part of his daily life, had transformed into a terrifying ordeal, a stark reminder of the harsh realities of racial profiling and the ever-present threat of unjust treatment. He braced himself for whatever might come next, his mind racing, his future suddenly uncertain. Isaiah tried again, his voice rising slightly in desperation. "Officer, I really was just going home. I'm a student at Northwood High. I can show you my ID, my school books." He fumbled with his backpack, pulling out his student ID and a textbook, offering them to the officer as evidence of his innocence. His hands shook so violently that the books almost slipped from his grasp. Officer Miller didn't even glance at the ID or the books. He simply stared at Isaiah, his expression hardening, his suspicion deepening. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, the only sound the rhythmic thump of Isaiah's racing heart. The afternoon sun, once warm and comforting, now felt cold and menacing, casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to amplify the growing tension. "Don't lie to me, kid," Officer Miller said, his voice low and menacing. "I know what I see, and I see you loitering. I see you hanging around with a bad crowd." His words were a blunt instrument, each syllable a blow to Isaiah's already fragile composure. Isaiah felt a surge of anger, a hot, righteous fury that threatened to boil over. He wanted to scream, to shout his innocence, to demand to be treated with respect, but he knew that any outburst would only escalate the situation, making it worse. He took a deep breath, trying to regain control, trying to remember Ms. Evans's advice. Remain calm, be respectful, and document everything. He fumbled for his phone in his pocket, hoping to discreetly record the interaction. "Officer," Isaiah said, his voice trembling but firm, "I'm not lying. I'm telling you the truth. I was just walking home from school. I've never been in trouble before. I'm a good student. I volunteer in the community." Officer Miller cut him off, his voice rising in volume. "Enough with the excuses," he snapped. "I've had enough of this. You're going to come with me. We're going to have a little chat at the station." He reached for Isaiah's arm, his grip tight and forceful. Isaiah instinctively pulled away, his fear escalating into panic. He knew he was in trouble, that this situation was spiraling out of control. He was being unjustly accused, his rights violated, his dignity trampled upon. He struggled against the officer's grip, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No, officer, please," Isaiah pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. "I haven't done anything wrong. You can't arrest me." He tried to pull away again, but Officer Miller's grip tightened, his strength overwhelming Isaiah's desperate resistance. The officer's face was contorted with anger, his eyes blazing with suspicion. He seemed determined to arrest Isaiah, regardless of his pleas of innocence. Isaiah felt a wave of despair wash over him, a crushing sense of helplessness. He was trapped, caught in a web of prejudice and injustice, his future suddenly uncertain, his dreams threatened by the arbitrary power of a biased police officer. The quiet suburban street, once a familiar and comforting path, now felt like a hostile and dangerous place, a stark reminder of the systemic racism that permeated society. He struggled silently, his body tense, his spirit crushed by the weight of the officer's unjust accusation. The afternoon light seemed to dim, the warm hues of the setting sun replaced by a chilling, oppressive darkness. Officer Miller's grip tightened, his knuckles white against Isaiah's arm. "I'm warning you, kid," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Don't resist arrest. It'll only make things worse." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, a palpable sense of fear gripping Isaiah. He felt the cold steel of the officer's handcuffs pressing against his wrists, a chilling prelude to the indignity and injustice that awaited him. Isaiah struggled weakly, his efforts futile against the officer's superior strength. He could feel the tears welling up in his eyes, a mixture of fear, anger, and humiliation. He was being arrested, unjustly accused, his future jeopardized by the arbitrary power of a biased police officer. The injustice of it all was overwhelming, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate him. "Officer, please," Isaiah pleaded again, his voice choked with emotion. "I haven't done anything wrong. You're making a mistake." He tried to reason with the officer, to appeal to his sense of justice, but his words were lost in the storm of the officer's anger and prejudice. Officer Miller ignored Isaiah's pleas, his focus solely on subduing him. He pushed Isaiah roughly against the side of his cruiser, the metal cold and unforgiving against Isaiah's back. The pain shot through his arm, a sharp, searing agony that added to his mounting distress. "I'm arresting you for loitering," Officer Miller announced, his voice hard and unwavering. "In resisting arrest, you're going to spend the night in jail. Think about your actions." The words were a cruel blow, a final confirmation of the injustice Isaiah was enduring. Isaiah felt a surge of despair, a crushing sense of helplessness. He was trapped, caught in a web of prejudice and injustice, his future hanging precariously in the balance. He closed his eyes, his mind racing, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear, anger, and resignation. He was a good kid, a responsible student, a contributing member of his community, yet he was being treated like a criminal, his dignity and rights trampled upon. Officer Miller continued to berate Isaiah, his words laced with contempt and hostility. He accused Isaiah of being a troublemaker, a liar, a menace to society. He threatened further harassment, suggesting that Isaiah would face more severe consequences if he didn't cooperate fully. The officer's words were like blows to the gut, each one adding to Isaiah's growing sense of despair and humiliation. Isaiah remained silent, his body trembling, his spirit crushed. He knew that any attempt to defend himself would only escalate the situation, making things worse. He had to endure the officer's verbal abuse, to bear the weight of his unjust accusation, to wait for some kind of intervention, some glimmer of hope that would break through the suffocating darkness that had enveloped him. The officer's threats continued, escalating in intensity. He mentioned a possible record, future consequences, and the impact this arrest would have on Isaiah's future prospects. The weight of these potential repercussions added to the immense pressure Isaiah was feeling. He felt trapped, his voice caught in his throat, his body stiff with fear and anger. The once familiar street now felt alien and hostile, a stark reminder of the systemic racism and injustice that he, as a young black man, had to navigate. The setting sun cast long, ominous shadows, mirroring the darkness that had fallen upon his afternoon. He waited, his hope dwindling, for something, anything, to change the course of this unjust encounter. Just as Officer Miller was about to shove Isaiah into the back of the cruiser, a voice cut through the tense silence. "Officer Miller, what is going on here?" The voice, strong and authoritative, belonged to Ms. Evans, Isaiah's history teacher. She stood a short distance away, her face a mask of controlled fury, her eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Her presence was a sudden, unexpected beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness that had enveloped Isaiah. Officer Miller visibly stiffened at the sound of Ms. Evans's voice. He knew her reputation, a respected educator, a prominent community figure, a woman known for her unwavering commitment to social justice and her outspokenness against injustice. Her intervention was a significant shift in the dynamics of the situation, a potential disruption to his planned course of action. He turned, his expression shifting from anger to a forced composure, attempting to mask his discomfort at being confronted by Ms. Evans. "Ms. Evans," he said, his voice losing some of its harshness, his tone becoming slightly more measured. "I'm just arresting this young man for loitering." Ms. Evans stepped closer, her gaze unwavering, her presence radiating confidence and authority. "Loitering?" she repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. "Is that what you're calling it? I saw the entire interaction, Officer Miller. This young man was simply walking home from school." Officer Miller shifted uncomfortably, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. He knew that Ms. Evans's testimony would be significant, her credibility unquestionable within the community. Her presence had transformed the situation, shifting the power dynamic and introducing a significant challenge to his actions. "He was loitering," Officer Miller insisted, his voice strained, his confidence waning. "He was hanging around with a group of other kids. They were causing trouble." His words lacked conviction, his attempt to justify his actions sounding weak and unconvincing. Ms. Evans raised an eyebrow, her expression conveying her disbelief. "I saw no such thing," she stated firmly. "I saw a young man walking home from school, minding his own business, unjustly stopped and harassed by a police officer." Her words were a direct challenge to Officer Miller's authority, a public denouncement of his biased actions. She turned her attention to Isaiah, her expression softening with concern. "Isaiah, are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentle and reassuring, a stark contrast to the harshness of Officer Miller's demeanor. Her presence was a soothing balm to Isaiah's wounded spirit, a source of strength in his moment of despair. Isaiah, overwhelmed by Ms. Evans's intervention, could only nod, his voice caught in his throat. He felt a surge of gratitude, a wave of relief washing over him. Ms. Evans's arrival had changed everything, transforming a seemingly hopeless situation into one with a glimmer of hope. Her unwavering support, her unwavering belief in his innocence, was a lifeline in his moment of despair. He knew that with Ms. Evans on his side, he had a fighting chance. The arrival of his teacher had shifted the power dynamic, introducing a significant challenge to the officer's authority and providing Isaiah with a powerful ally in his fight for justice. Ms. Evans turned her full attention back to Officer Miller, her gaze unwavering, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Miller," she said, "I'm asking you again. What evidence do you have to support your accusation? What specific actions did Isaiah take that constitute loitering? What trouble was he causing?" Officer Miller hesitated, his carefully constructed narrative beginning to unravel. He had no concrete evidence, no witnesses, no specific details to support his accusation. His actions had been based solely on his own prejudiced assumptions, a snap judgment fueled by racial bias. Ms. Evans's pointed questions exposed the weakness of his position, highlighting the lack of substance behind his actions. He was just acting suspiciously, Officer Miller stammered, his words lacking conviction. His attempt to justify his actions sounded weak and unconvincing, a flimsy excuse that failed to mask the underlying prejudice that had motivated his actions. Ms. Evans's expression hardened. Acting suspiciously, she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Is that the standard you use to determine probable cause, officer? Is acting suspiciously a legal term? Or is it simply a convenient excuse to harass young black men? Her words were a direct accusation, a public condemnation of Officer Miller's biased behavior. She continued, her voice rising slightly in intensity. Let me be clear, Officer Miller. I witnessed the entire interaction. Isaiah was walking home from school. He was polite, respectful, and cooperative. Your accusation is baseless, unfounded, and frankly, offensive. It reeks of racial profiling. Her words were a powerful indictment of Officer Miller's actions, a public declaration of his prejudice. Officer Miller's face flushed crimson, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He was being publicly challenged, his authority questioned, his prejudice exposed. He attempted to defend himself, to justify his actions, but his words were weak and unconvincing, easily refuted by Ms. Evans's sharp observations and unwavering logic. Ms. Evans, he said, his voice tight with frustration, I'm doing my job. I'm keeping this neighborhood safe. Is that what you call keeping the neighborhood safe? Ms. Evans retorted, her voice sharp and unwavering. Harassing innocent students? Profiling young black men based on nothing more than your own prejudiced assumptions? I think you need a refresher course in community policing, officer, and perhaps a lesson in basic human decency. Her words were a scathing rebuke, a public condemnation of Officer Miller's unprofessional and biased conduct. She turned her attention to the growing crowd that had gathered, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. I urge all of you to remember what you have witnessed today, she said, her voice resonating with authority. This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern, a systemic problem that we must address. We must demand accountability, we must fight for justice, and we must stand up against racial injustice wherever we see it. Her words were a call to action, an inspiration to the onlookers, a powerful testament to her unwavering commitment to social justice. The confrontation had shifted from a simple police stop to a public display of racial bias, fueled by Ms. Evans's courageous intervention and unwavering commitment to justice. As Ms. Evans's voice rang out, denouncing Officer Miller's actions and highlighting the underlying racial bias, a small crowd began to gather. Initially, onlookers had simply paused, curious about the commotion. But as Ms. Evans's powerful words exposed the injustice of the situation, their initial curiosity transformed into active engagement, their expressions shifting from detached observation to concerned interest and then to outright outrage. Wordlessly, several neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the rising tension. Others stopped their cars, rolling down windows to listen, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and disbelief. The quiet suburban street, once peaceful and tranquil, had become a focal point of growing tension, a stage for a public confrontation between a respected community leader and a police officer whose actions were being openly questioned. The onlookers watched, their silence a powerful testament to the gravity of the situation. They witnessed Ms. Evans's unwavering courage, her unflinching challenge to Officer Miller's authority. They heard her articulate condemnation of racial profiling, her impassioned plea for justice. They saw Isaiah, a young man unjustly accused, his spirit crushed but his hope rekindled by Ms. Evans's intervention. They observed Officer Miller, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of Ms. Evans's accusations, his attempts at justification sounding weak and unconvincing. Among the onlookers were several people who knew Isaiah, who knew his character, his academic achievements, his contributions to the community. Their presence added another layer of complexity to the situation. Their silent support, a powerful endorsement of Isaiah's innocence. Their knowledge of Isaiah's character served as a counterpoint to Officer Miller's baseless accusations, adding weight to Ms. Evans's challenge to the officer's authority. The growing crowd became a silent jury, their collective gaze a powerful force that amplified the tension of the confrontation. Their presence transformed the situation from a private dispute between a teacher and a police officer into a public spectacle, a community-wide reckoning with racial bias and police misconduct. The weight of their silent judgment bore down on Officer Miller. Adding to the pressure he was already feeling under Ms. Evans's relentless questioning. Some onlookers began to murmur amongst themselves, their conversations a low hum of indignation and disbelief. Others pulled out their phones, documenting the unfolding events, their videos and photos poised to become evidence of police misconduct, a testament to the power of citizen journalism in exposing injustice. The digital record of the event would serve as a powerful counterpoint to Officer Miller's narrative, providing irrefutable evidence of his biased actions. The atmosphere crackled with tension, the silence punctuated by the occasional gasp or murmur from the crowd. The confrontation was no longer a private matter. It had become a public spectacle, a community-wide reckoning with racial bias and police misconduct. The silent judgment of the onlookers added another layer of pressure on Officer Miller, amplifying the weight of Ms. Evans's accusations and highlighting the injustice of the situation. The once quiet street had transformed into a public forum, a stage for a crucial confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences. The silent witnesses, armed with their phones and their collective outrage, were poised to play a significant role in the unfolding events. Facing the mounting pressure from Ms. Evans and the increasingly critical gaze of the onlookers, Officer Miller attempted to salvage the situation, to justify his actions and regain control of the narrative. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and launched into a series of increasingly unconvincing explanations. "Ms. Evans," he began, his voice strained, "you're misunderstanding the situation. I was simply conducting a routine check. This area has seen an increase in petty crime lately, and I was just doing my job, ensuring the safety of the neighborhood." His words sounded hollow, lacking the conviction necessary to persuade anyone, especially given the obvious racial bias underpinning his actions. Ms. Evans raised an eyebrow, her expression conveying her skepticism. "A routine check," she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what you call it? Stopping a young black man walking home from school, accusing him of loitering, and threatening arrest without any evidence." Her words were a direct challenge to Officer Miller's attempt at justification, highlighting the absurdity of his claims. Officer Miller continued, his explanations becoming increasingly convoluted and desperate. He cited vague reports of suspicious activity in the area, mentioning unsubstantiated rumors and anecdotal evidence. He spoke of a need to maintain a visible police presence to deter crime and to ensure the safety of the community. But his words lacked specificity, his justifications sounding hollow and unconvincing in the face of Ms. Evans's unwavering challenge. "Officer," Ms. Evans interrupted, her voice calm but firm, "your explanations are weak and unconvincing. You're attempting to justify your actions with vague generalities and unsubstantiated claims. Your behavior was clearly racially motivated, a blatant example of profiling." Her words were a powerful indictment, exposing the weakness of Officer Miller's defense and highlighting the underlying prejudice that had driven his actions. Officer Miller attempted to deflect the accusation, shifting the blame onto Isaiah. He claimed that Isaiah had been acting suspiciously, that his demeanor had been evasive, that he had refused to cooperate. But his claims were contradicted by the witnesses who had observed the interaction, their silent presence a powerful testament to Isaiah's innocence. Ms. Evans countered each of Officer Miller's claims with precise observations, highlighting the inconsistencies in his narrative and exposing the flaws in his logic. She pointed out that Isaiah had been polite and cooperative, that he had readily offered his identification and school books as evidence of his innocence. She challenged Officer Miller's assertion that Isaiah had been acting suspiciously, arguing that his nervousness was a natural response to being unjustly stopped and harassed by a police officer. As Officer Miller's attempts at justification fell apart, his frustration grew. He became increasingly agitated, his voice rising in volume, his demeanor shifting from forced composure to open hostility. He tried to regain control of the situation, to assert his authority, but his efforts were futile. Ms. Evans's unwavering challenge, the growing crowd's silent condemnation, and the obvious weakness of his own defense had left him exposed, his prejudice laid bare for all to see. His attempts to justify his actions had only served to further undermine his credibility and expose the underlying racial bias that had motivated his actions. His carefully constructed defense had crumbled under the weight of Ms. Evans's relentless questioning and the silent judgment of the onlookers. Finally, defeated and exposed, Officer Miller released Isaiah. The handcuffs clattered to the ground, a metallic sound that echoed the shattering of his authority and the exposure of his prejudice. Isaiah, though physically free, felt shaken, his body trembling, his mind reeling from the ordeal. The encounter had left him deeply affected, the injustice of the situation leaving a lasting mark on his psyche. Ms. Evans placed a comforting hand on Isaiah's arm, her presence a source of strength and support in the aftermath of the traumatic encounter. She spoke to him in a calm, reassuring voice, validating his feelings and emphasizing his innocence. Her words were a balm to his wounded spirit, a reminder that he had done nothing wrong, that he had been the victim of unjust treatment. The onlookers, many of whom had witnessed the entire ordeal, offered words of support and encouragement. Their expressions of solidarity served as a powerful counterpoint to the injustice Isaiah had experienced, a testament to the community's commitment to fairness and equality. Their collective presence offered Isaiah a sense of belonging, a reassurance that he was not alone in his experience, that others recognized the injustice he had suffered. As Isaiah walked away, accompanied by Ms. Evans, the crowd dispersed slowly, their conversations a low hum of indignation and disbelief. The incident had left a deep impression, stirring the community in ways that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the confrontation. The event had become a focal point, a catalyst for broader conversations about racial profiling, police accountability, and the systemic injustices faced by young black men. The quiet suburban street, once a familiar and comforting path, now felt different, charged with the lingering tension of the confrontation. The incident had shattered the illusion of safety and security, exposing the underlying vulnerability faced by members of the community, particularly young black men. The feeling of unease and uncertainty lingered, a stark reminder of the pervasive nature of racial bias and the need for ongoing vigilance against injustice. Isaiah, though physically unharmed, carried the emotional scars of the encounter. The humiliation, the fear, the injustice. These were wounds that would take time to heal. He felt a deep sense of betrayal, a violation of his trust in law enforcement, a questioning of his place in society. The incident had shaken his confidence, leaving him feeling vulnerable and exposed. The community, too, was deeply affected. The incident had served as a wake-up call, exposing the presence of racial bias within the local police force and highlighting the need for reform. The event sparked conversations, debates, and demands for accountability. The community's response ranged from outrage and anger to calls for increased police training, improved community relations, and enhanced mechanisms for addressing complaints of police misconduct. The incident had become a catalyst for change, a turning point in the ongoing struggle for racial justice and equality. The quiet suburban street, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, now bore the weight of a significant event, its quietness replaced by the lingering tension of a community grappling with the implications of a racially charged confrontation. News of the incident spread rapidly, fueled by word-of-mouth accounts and the proliferation of videos and photos shared on social media. Within hours, the story had gone viral, transforming a local event into a national conversation about racial profiling and police brutality. The initial shock and disbelief gave way to outrage and anger, as people from all walks of life reacted to the injustice Isaiah had suffered. The initial wave of outrage was largely confined to the immediate community, but as the story gained traction online, it quickly spread beyond local boundaries. Social media platforms became battlegrounds for debate, with some defending Officer Miller's actions and others condemning his blatant prejudice. The incident became a flashpoint, highlighting the deep divisions within society on issues of race, policing, and justice. The local news media picked up the story, reporting on the incident with varying degrees of sensitivity and objectivity. Some outlets focused on the details of the confrontation, highlighting the disparity between Officer Miller's claims and the eyewitness accounts. Others emphasized the broader context, linking the incident to a larger pattern of racial profiling and police misconduct. The media coverage served as a catalyst, amplifying the community's outrage and fueling the calls for reform. Community leaders, activists, and politicians weighed in, condemning Officer Miller's actions and demanding accountability. Many called for an independent investigation into the incident, advocating for transparency and justice. Others emphasized the need for comprehensive police reform, advocating for changes in training, policies, and procedures. The incident became a rallying point, uniting diverse groups under a common banner of justice and equality. Public forums and town hall meetings were organized, providing spaces for community members to express their concerns, share their experiences, and demand change. These events became emotional outpourings, with many expressing their frustration and anger at the systemic injustices they faced. The discussions highlighted the need for increased dialogue, improved communication, and enhanced trust between the police and the community. Petitions were circulated, demanding Officer Miller's dismissal and the implementation of stricter policies to prevent future incidents of racial profiling. These petitions gained thousands of signatures, demonstrating the widespread support for change and the community's collective determination to address the issue of racial bias within the local police force. The online activism served as a powerful force, amplifying the voices of those demanding justice and accountability. The incident also sparked a renewed focus on civic engagement. Many people who had previously been apathetic or disengaged became actively involved in local politics, advocating for change at the municipal and state levels. The incident served as a catalyst for increased political participation, empowering individuals to become active agents of change in their communities. The widespread outrage and calls for reform demonstrated the power of collective action and the community's determination to address the systemic issues that had led to the incident. The once quiet suburban street had become a symbol of resistance, its quietness replaced by the powerful voices of a community demanding justice and equality. In the wake of the public outcry, the police department launched an internal investigation into Officer Miller's conduct. The investigation was initially met with skepticism, given the department's history of downplaying or dismissing complaints of police misconduct. However, the sheer volume of evidence, eyewitness accounts, video footage, and social media posts made it impossible to ignore the gravity of the situation. The investigation was overseen by an independent review board, composed of community members and law enforcement professionals from outside the department. This ensured a degree of impartiality, minimizing the potential for bias and increasing the credibility of the findings. The board's composition was a direct response to the community's demand for transparency and accountability. The review board meticulously examined all available evidence, interviewing witnesses, reviewing police reports, and analyzing video footage. Their investigation revealed a pattern of biased behavior on the part of Officer Miller, extending far beyond the incident involving Isaiah. The investigation uncovered numerous instances of racial profiling, unwarranted stops, and excessive force, all involving young black men in the community. The board's findings were damning, exposing a systemic problem within the police department. Officer Miller's actions were not isolated incidents. They were symptomatic of a larger culture of bias and impunity. The report highlighted a lack of adequate training on cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and de-escalation techniques. It also pointed to a failure of internal oversight, with complaints of police misconduct often dismissed or ignored. The report's release sparked a fresh wave of outrage and calls for reform. Community members demanded accountability, not just for Officer Miller, but for the entire police department. They called for changes in training, policies, and procedures, emphasizing the need for greater transparency and community oversight. The report's findings served as a catalyst, accelerating the momentum for change and strengthening the resolve of those demanding justice and accountability. As a direct result of the investigation, Officer Miller was dismissed from the police force. His actions were deemed to be in violation of department policy and inconsistent with the principles of community policing. His dismissal was a victory for those who had fought for justice and accountability, a testament to the power of collective action and the effectiveness of public pressure. However, the dismissal of Officer Miller was only the first step in a long process of reform. The police department implemented a series of changes designed to address the systemic issues identified in the review board's report. These changes included enhanced training on cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and de-escalation techniques, improved procedures for handling complaints of police misconduct, and increased community engagement initiatives. The reforms were a direct response to the community's demands, a recognition of the need for fundamental changes in police culture and practices. The investigation and its aftermath served as a turning point, marking a significant step towards greater accountability and a renewed commitment to community policing. The incident involving Isaiah and Officer Miller served as a catalyst for significant and lasting change within the community. The initial outrage and calls for reform led to a series of initiatives designed to improve police training, foster community dialogue, and raise awareness of racial profiling. The police department implemented a comprehensive training program focused on cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and de-escalation techniques. Officers underwent mandatory training sessions, learning to recognize and address their own biases, to communicate effectively with diverse communities, and to de-escalate potentially volatile situations without resorting to excessive force. The training program was developed in consultation with community leaders and experts in racial justice, ensuring its relevance and effectiveness. The department also established a new system for handling complaints of police misconduct. This system included independent review boards, transparent investigation procedures, and clear accountability mechanisms. The changes were designed to ensure that future complaints would be taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, and addressed appropriately. The new system was a direct response to the community's demand for greater transparency and accountability. In addition to these internal reforms, the police department launched a series of community engagement initiatives designed to foster trust and improve communication between officers and residents. These initiatives included community policing programs, neighborhood watch meetings, and youth outreach events. The goal was to create a more collaborative relationship between the police and the community, fostering mutual understanding and respect. The community also played a crucial role in the process of change. Community leaders, activists, and residents organized forums, workshops, and discussions focused on issues of race, policing, and justice. These events provided opportunities for open dialogue, allowing community members to share their experiences, express their concerns, and work together to find solutions. The community's active participation was essential in shaping the direction of reform. The incident also led to a greater awareness of racial profiling within the community. Educational programs were implemented in schools and community centers, teaching young people about their rights and encouraging them to report instances of discrimination. The educational initiatives aimed to empower young people, equipping them with the knowledge and skills necessary to navigate interactions with law enforcement. The long-term impact of the incident extended beyond immediate reforms. It fostered a greater understanding of the systemic nature of racial bias, highlighting the need for ongoing vigilance and sustained efforts to address inequality. The incident served as a powerful reminder that justice requires not only accountability for individual misconduct, but also systemic change to address the root causes of injustice. The community's collective efforts resulted in a more just and equitable society, demonstrating the power of collective action in addressing systemic issues. The once quiet suburban street, once the scene of a racially charged confrontation, now stood as a symbol of progress, a testament to the community's resilience and its commitment to justice and equality.